Warner Brothers, the gigantic media conglomerate that's, not quite on Disney's level quite yet. I'm sure we could get into that comparison later. They've been pulling some big moves, among which, multiverses, which we're gonna try to load up, now in the background for you while we talk about some relevant things here.
The Warner Discovery merger has been an absolute fucking disaster from the very beginning. Discovery's whole lineup and their whole model is mostly based on, reality shows and documentaries and, unscripted content. Warner Brothers is very much the exact opposite, and they're trying to run it on that model. They immediately decided they were going to, try and save money by just cutting costs, and they immediately took a bunch of stuff off of HBO Max that was already bought and paid for, including, Infinity Train and things like that, which they're gonna go sell that off to other streaming services, presumably. But they're not only doing that, there's several projects which are currently shopping around. They're still in production, but it's kind of in limbo as to what's going to happen with them, because there's many projects which were going to be HBO Max originals that are now just not going to HBO Max. But we lost Scoob Holiday Haunt, and we lost Batgirl. Just completely. They wrote it off as a tax credit and ash-canned it. They legally cannot put it out because of the way they wrote it off on their taxes during the merger. Everybody was hoping that some employee would save it and leak it the same way that happened with the Fantastic Four film that was made in the 90s that got ash-canned, but that movie's not going to be saved. Employees went to go look and save what they could. That film has already been deleted from archive. All that hard work is permanently lost, and they had that movie pretty much done.
Has that ever... I'm sure it's happened maybe once, but I'm not sure of any other case that's even similar in scale to that. Because why would you do that unless you're Warner Brothers, right? It doesn't happen often, because presumably it's not a very good idea, right?
Well, everybody was talking about, too, how bad of a look it is that they canceled that movie and some of the other HBO projects when they're still moving forward with the Flash movie with Ezra Miller. When that's the one that's giving them way more negative press. People were excited for Batgirl. That had a Michael Keaton role. He was coming back as Batman for that. Yes, he's coming back as Batman for Flash, for the new Flash movie too. But, we just lost another Michael Keaton role. Batman movie. What the hell? So, hear me out. Everybody's okay, it's racism, they cut, this project, but they're leaving the others. But really, they have said flat out their focus is they're cutting a lot of the streaming content and focusing on big theatrical releases. That makes sense. I don't think it's a good model necessarily. I don't think it necessarily makes sense business-wise currently. But I understand their logic. They might be more willing to sacrifice some projects because of, bias and stuff, but I don't think it's blatant racism in that way. And I don't think that keeping Ezra on at this point is because they want to either. If they're focusing on big theatrical releases, the new Flash movie is what it all hinges on. That's how they've been planning on resetting the DCU for a while. It makes sense. It's where the DCU needs to go in many ways. But yeah, when the movie's already done and Ezra Miller's in every fucking frame, what do you do?
This is more than just an individual studio being bad. I'm wondering if, our resident economists have any thing to offer from that angle on just how we got here.
Part of it, as I'm sure Kevin could attest to perhaps even greater detail, is intellectual property, right? Warner Brothers claims monopoly ownership over all of these films, and so it's not as though someone can, without fear of legal reprisal, leak this or decide to market it on their own. These ideas, which are not inherently scarce, these digital files, which are not inherently scarce, and so on, are, in practice, legally monopolized under using threats of violence via the state. And the claim used to justify these is because there are positive spillovers associated with the with ideas and with innovations and with artistic creation, we're going to have not enough of them if people are free to duplicate work of others. And so the argument for intellectual property is we internalize these positive externalities by granting a set of monopoly privileges. What this illustrates, as many other things do as well, is that the direction of the effect is not just one way or another. Instead, intellectual property can create incentives for creative activity that might not otherwise occur, but it also can prevent people from accessing creative works by directly prohibiting sharing with the public. And incidentally, it can also raise the cost of creating creative works, right? So if you or I or anybody on this stream wanted to create a Batman movie, or if we wanted to create a film that used music or archival footage that had ambiguous status with regards to its intellectual property status, intellectual property laws raise the cost of engaging in that iterative creative activity, and by doing so, they can reduce creative activity. And this isn't just a conclusion that anarchists came to. There's a Supreme Court amicus brief that numerous eminent economists, James Buchanan, Milton Friedman, Hal Varian, Kenneth Arrow, Ronald Coase, and various others whose names I'm forgetting, signed on to, that oppose the Copyright Term Extension Act, what we might colloquially also call the Mickey Mouse Protection Act, right? That opposed the Supreme Court saying that that was constitutional because they argued that these weren't IP abolitionists, these economists, but they argued extending copyright terms for so long after a thing has been created doesn't create incentives to create it. It's already been created. For a creator just making decisions early on, that creator has some set of incentives, but unless they have a lot of foresight and don't discount the future very much, something decades after they're gone is not going to impact their decision all that much. But when you have copyrights lasting this long, it very much restricts the ability to engage in iterative creative work that builds on pre-existing creative works. And so copyrights and patents can become a barrier to innovation and artistic creation just as much as an incentive to engage in innovation and artistic creation.
And it creates perverse incentives in another way. About 200 years ago, Thomas Hodgkin argued in regard to landlordism that the ability to hold land out of use meant that landlords had an incentive not to allow land to be put to productive use unless it was sufficiently productive to give them some minimal level of acceptable profit. So there was all kinds of productive activity that land could have been used for that it wasn't, because the amount of surplus generated wasn't big enough to be of interest to the landlords. And similarly with intellectual property, with the guaranteed profit that comes from copyright and the ability to target price to people's willingness or ability to pay rather than cost of production, there's a really big incentive not even to bother marketing stuff if the profit level is too low. Even if it's profitable, it's not sufficiently profitable to make it worthwhile to them. It's something that if there weren't copyright, they would have every incentive to put everything out there that might make any money at all. But they can instead decide just to focus on a few properties that are the biggest cash cows and just delete everything else from the catalog.
And everybody acts like getting rid of copyright would be confusing as to what's, especially in works of media as to what's the original and what's, unofficial. But I mean, we look at works that have fallen in the public domain. Nobody's confused as to which Sherlock Holmes stories are part of the original author's canon and which are done by other people. And when you get in the realm of comics, half those canons are so convoluted that it honestly doesn't fucking matter. It's not, those canons are just all over the place. And you constantly have authors revisiting canons that have been, long forgotten. You have characters that from other past labels that fall into the public domain and then get picked up by other publishers and start to be published. Hell, one of my favorite stories was one of my favorite interesting characters that crossed over due to rights battles was when Image Comics became a thing. Their whole thing was they were a creator-owned label, and everything you created for them, you owned. They would publish, but you owned. You owned any reprint rights, everything. Full control, you could take your shit anywheres. Neil Gaiman ended up working for on Spawn for a minute as a work-for-hire gig. He created a character called Angela. He argued that since he created that and it was a worker-owned publisher, he owned that character. Todd McFarlane argued that it was a work-for-hire job for his comic. He owned it. He was pulling the same shit that all the people that left Marvel and DC to start Image were complaining about. Gaiman won the battle, and he actually went and took Angela and sold her to Marvel. Now she's Thor's sister from a forgotten 10th realm called Heaven. That character got taken and put into a completely different universe and reimagined. Imagine what people could do without copyright law. Then we can have the Spawn Angela and the Thor sister Angela, running side by side. Why the hell not? Everybody's complaining about the direction of the Star Wars franchise. And, so many people are like, oh, well, I'd rather this, old school EU timeline or this or that. Okay, then that's your fucking headcanon. And then go enjoy every fan fiction and every EU novel and go read the Duel of Fates comic adaptation that people did because they hated the episode 9 we did get. Whatever. Go do it. Make it.
I just want to share quickly, I'm probably going to get booted soon, but on the Star Wars question, it was so funny to watch people hating the recent movies. And I didn't love them, but I wasn't too upset because I knew we were going to get other totally different content from the franchise. And now we have a series being made by the folks who made Rogue One. And that's my Star Wars.
Yeah.
But I also was all ready to hate Multiversus. And then they made this great choice right here, which is the tutorials you play as Old God Shaggy. And it was just too funny. The meme magic got me. I'm super into it. So
first off, let's establish something. They're trying to make this seem like it's its own game. This is a Space Jam 2 game that takes place in the serververse.
Well, in the gameplay is Super Smash Brothers.
Yeah, it is. But it is. Honestly, I think this has to take place in the serververse in Space Jam 2, where all their properties are crammed together. I feel like that's the vibe they're going for. It's even a similar animation style at times. And you even have LeBron James in this one as a fucking character. But this is everything Warner Brothers owns. And Discovery will probably throw some of their shit in there eventually. It just seems like a cash grab, and it's surprising that it's as good as it is for what it is.
I'd like to go back to what Logan was talking about earlier about the problem of verifying authenticity because there's so much stuff out there. I think it was Jaron Lanier, if that's the correct way of pronouncing his name, who made the Library of Babel argument that the internet was just this giant, unsorted mishmash of stuff that nobody knew what was authentic and what was bad knockoffs and so on. And basically he was a fucking dipshit. I don't know why everyone thinks he's such a goddamn genius, because every argument he makes about the internet just indicates that he's completely clueless about how anything works in practical terms. He was just completely minimizing any possibility of human agency or creativity, when it came to adapting to the situation and developing new curatorial techniques. It's very easy to determine what's authentic and what's not. It's just like the people who argue that news off the internet, every publication that exists on dead trees, or virtually every publication, also has an online version that's very easy to verify for authenticity. You use exactly the same techniques to evaluate the legitimacy and credibility of sources online you do in meat space.
But not everybody checks the legitimacy of the sources that they look at. That's where you get the phenomena that we have in politics now of people falling for fake news and conspiracy theories.
I did my own research.
Yeah, and so that does come up with, the questions of how gullible are people? And I mean, these are complex issues to solve. And honestly, when it comes to which is the original story, that's way less of an important issue than are you getting factual news off the internet. In terms of figuring out authenticity and verifying things and things like that, we have way bigger issues than...
Before the internet ever existed, there were people who read the Spotlight and thought it was a credible newspaper, people that wrote reports out of the encyclopedia. The inability to determine what's a credible source and what's not, and to evaluate, primary versus secondary sources and that sort of thing is a problem that's always existed.
And when it comes to media, things we consume for fun, that tends to be less important of whether it's authentic. It's whether it brings us joy. Who cares if it's by the original creator? Sure, those people might want recognition, and absolutely, and they deserve it if they're, creating good stuff. But honestly, there's people that are good at world building, and then other people take their stuff and do better with it, which arguably that's what a lot of people say about George Lucas. Some people's favorite Star Wars stuff is not even his movies, it's some of the comics and novels and things like that spun off of it. He created a great world, but some people's favorite Star Wars media is not even the original movies.
Well, I think you could take just about any Star Wars fan and ask them after they had just seen episodes 4, 5, and 6, what kind of backstory they imagined in the last days of the Jedi and the fall of the Republic, and any of their backstories would have been better than what Lucas came up with in episodes 1 through 3.
That's the beauty of fan fiction, is that gives us a space around copyright, to work around copyright laws to create things like fan films, fan stories, fan fiction stories, all these different things. But, you can't sell it for a profit, which means that you can't sit there and make money to put back into those projects. But now we're seeing that people can get around that by not selling any of that stuff, but crowdfunding and doing Patreons, because they're not technically selling any copyrighted merch or selling any copyrighted, media or media including copyrighted stuff. they are raising money, in order to make such a thing, but they're not actually selling those things.
And so much of the computer and video technology has cheapened so radically that it's a lot more feasible now to produce fan fiction and knockoffs at much lower cost than it cost the studios to produce the original movies.
The creative people behind these projects really enjoy seeing fans engage to that level and create their own things out of it as well. And I mean, we see creators who operate without strict adherence to copyright law, like Cory Doctorow, who, I mean, he's had people come up with plays and musicals based off his novels. And it's beautiful. Like, I think a lot of creators would love to see that. And yes, John Clayton, more films should go the Kickstarter route instead of getting loans. Films should be crowdfunded. Comics should be crowdfunded. All of that fun stuff.
So one thing about crowdfunding is that it shows a clear way of overcoming the problem that people anticipate and use to justify intellectual property, right? Like, if you ask a typical economist, at least, why they support intellectual property rights, if they do, then their reason is going to be because knowledge and creative ideas are, if unprotected by IP, a public good. That is, my experiencing the film doesn't mean you can't experience the film, so it's non-rivalrous, right? My use of it doesn't detract from your use of it, and it's absent IP, not very easy to exclude people from it. So it's a public good. But of course, crowdfunding is a classic way of producing public goods. It has economically the features of what economist Alex Tabarrok calls a dominant assurance contract. That is, you can finance the creation of a non-excludable or not as easy to exclude from product by creating a system in which getting up to the threshold matters, and you only pay if you get to that threshold, and you can bundle it with excludable benefits, right? There are often particular tiers of rewards that you can donate a certain amount and get a particular rewards package from. And so this really gets at how the types of problems that people point to justify a particular intervention, in this case intellectual property, have a multiplicity of available solutions, and crowdfunding is one of them.
And it's infuriating that the biggest intellectual property landlords are companies like Disney, that just about everything they produce is cribbed out of the cultural commons. The Grimm brothers, Anderson, Kipling, Milne, Barrie. Hell, I think Mickey Mouse is probably about the only thing they ever came up with that wasn't plundered from the commons, and then they enclose it and get 100-year copyright terms on it.
Yeah, now they're manipulating Florida law and California law and every other, and U.S. law in general. Laws around the world, really.